On December 26, 1941, Heinz Guderian stood in a headquarters office in East Prussia, arguing for his professional life in front of a man who had 18 months earlier called him one of the finest tank commanders Germany had ever produced. Guderian had flown roughly 1,000 miles from the collapsing front lines outside Moscow, specifically to make this case in person, understanding that a telephone call or a written report would never adequately convey the desperation of what his divisions were actually experiencing in the snow. His Panzer forces, the same forces that had spearheaded the fastest and most devastating armored campaigns in the history of warfare, were freezing solid in temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, wearing summer uniforms because the German High Command had confidently predicted the campaign would conclude before winter arrived. Soviet forces, reinforced by fresh divisions transferred from Siberia, had launched a massive counteroffensive 3 weeks earlier that was now threatening to encircle and annihilate entire German formations that Hitler's standing orders forbade from retreating so much as a single kilometer. Guderian had already made his decision before this meeting, and both men in the room knew it. Days earlier, watching his troops facing encirclement in exposed positions with frozen equipment, no winter clothing, and rapidly dwindling ammunition, he had ordered a tactical withdrawal to a more defensible line, directly violating Hitler's explicit no-retreat directive. It was, by any conventional military logic, exactly the kind of decision the German General Staff System had spent decades training its officers to make. Assess the battlefield reality, protect the force, live to fight another day rather than sacrifice an army to a static position that could not be held. Hitler saw it differently. He viewed the unauthorized withdrawal as a direct challenge to his personal authority at the precise moment his authority most needed to appear unshakable. With the German army experiencing its first major reversal of the entire war, and Soviet propaganda broadcasting news of the retreat to every unit on the Eastern Front. The meeting ended the way most disagreements between Hitler and his generals would end for the remainder of the war. Guderian was relieved of command, not demoted, not reassigned to a lesser post, but removed entirely from operational command of the Panzer forces he had spent his entire career building into existence, at the exact moment the German army on the Eastern Front faced its first genuine crisis and needed, more than at any previous point in the war, the specific combination of tactical judgment and battlefield instinct that had made Guderian the single most successful practitioner of armored warfare that either side had yet produced. This is the story of why that decision, firing the architect of German armored doctrine during the one campaign where his particular expertise was most desperately needed, represents one of the clearest examples in the entire war of Hitler prioritizing personal authority over battlefield competence, and of how a decision rooted almost entirely in wounded pride would go on to remove exactly the kind of commander the German army could least afford to lose, at exactly the moment losing him would cost the most. To understand why Guderian's dismissal mattered so much more than an ordinary command change, you first have to understand what made him different from nearly every other general in the Wehrmacht, and how deeply his particular skills were woven into the very foundation of how Germany had learned to fight a mechanized war in the first place. Heinz Guderian did not simply command tanks well. He was, more than any other single individual in the German military establishment, the person most responsible for the theoretical and organizational existence of Germany's armored forces in the first place. During the 1920s and 1930s, while most military theorists across Europe still viewed tanks primarily as infantry support weapons, meant to advance slowly alongside foot soldiers and provide mobile firepower against fixed positions, Guderian developed and relentlessly promoted a radically different concept, that tanks, organized into concentrated divisions and combined with mobile infantry, artillery, and close air support, could operate as an independent striking force capable of punching through enemy lines entirely and then exploiting the resulting breach at a pace no defender could match, disrupting command structures and supply lines faster than an enemy could reorganize to respond. This concept, which would eventually become known internationally as Blitzkrieg, was not universally accepted within the German military even after Hitler came to power. Guderian spent years fighting institutional resistance from more conservative officers who remained skeptical that tanks could operate independently of traditional infantry-centered doctrine, and it was largely through his persistent advocacy, technical expertise, and eventually his own published writing on the subject that the concept gained enough traction to shape how Germany actually organized and equipped its Panzer divisions in the years leading up to the war. When German forces invaded Poland in September 1939 and then France in May 1940, achieving victories at a speed that stunned military observers around the world, they were executing in large part a theory of warfare that existed in its practical, workable form specifically because Guderian had spent the previous decade building it from first principles and fighting to have it adopted. Guderian's personal command performance during these campaigns matched his theoretical contributions. During the invasion of France, he led the Panzer thrust through the Ardennes forest that French military planners had considered essentially impassable to large mechanized formations, a judgment based on sound conventional military logic that simply failed to account for what a commander willing to push armored columns through terrain everyone else considered unsuitable could actually accomplish. Guderian's forces crossed the Meuse River and then advanced with a speed that repeatedly outran not just the expectations of the French defenders, but the caution of his own superior officers, who on more than one occasion during the campaign ordered him to slow down or halt his advance out of concern that his forces were dangerously overextended and exposed to a flanking counterattack. Guderian, backing his own tactical judgment against these more cautious instructions, continued pushing forward, and his aggressive pace became a central factor in the collapse of French resistance and the encirclement of Allied forces that would culminate in the Dunkirk evacuation. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Guderian commanded Panzer Group II, one of the most powerful concentrated armored formations in the entire German order of battle, and his forces performed with the same combination of speed and tactical aggression that had characterized his command in France. In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, Guderian's panzers achieved encirclement after encirclement of Soviet forces, capturing prisoners by the hundreds of thousands and advancing at a pace that, for a period, genuinely threatened to collapse Soviet resistance entirely before the country's vast size and mobilization capacity could be brought fully to bear. It was this same record of consistent, repeated tactical success that made his August 1941 disagreement with Hitler over the Kiev diversion and his later disagreement over the pace and timing of a final push toward Moscow carry the weight they did within the German High Command. Guderian was not a marginal or unproven voice offering hesitant objections. He was the single most successful practitioner of exactly the kind of warfare the entire invasion depended upon, and when he voiced strong professional disagreement with a decision, it came from a position of demonstrated expertise that few other officers in the entire Wehrmacht could claim to match. In late July 1941, with his panzer forces sitting roughly 200 miles from Moscow, and every operational instinct he possessed telling him the Soviet capital represented a target that had to be taken before autumn turned to winter, Guderian flew personally to Hitler's headquarters to argue against a proposed diversion of his forces south toward Kiev. His reasoning was grounded in exactly the kind of tactical and logistical analysis his entire career had trained him to perform. Moscow was not merely a symbolic prize, but the central rail hub through which Soviet reinforcements, supplies, and command communications for the entire western half of the country had to flow. Every week spent pursuing a secondary objective in Ukraine was a week the Soviet High Command could use to reorganize its shattered defenses and bring fresh divisions toward the capital. Hitler overruled him, prioritizing the economic resources of Ukraine and the opportunity for a massive encirclement at Kiev over the more direct, and in Guderian's professional judgment considerably more decisive, strike at Moscow itself. The Kiev encirclement when it came in September 1941, proved spectacularly successful in narrow tactical terms, netting over 600,000 Soviet prisoners in the single largest encirclement operation in the history of warfare. But the diversion cost Guderian's Panzer forces roughly 6 critical weeks during which the punishing were on tank engines and transmissions, from months of continuous operation over primitive Russian roads continued accumulating, and weeks during which Soviet military intelligence, aided significantly by a Soviet spy operating in Tokyo who had confirmed Japan had no intention of opening a second front in Siberia, began the process of transferring fresh, winter-trained divisions from the Soviet Far East toward the defense of Moscow. When German forces finally resumed the direct offensive toward the capital in October, under the operational name Typhoon, they advanced with the same tactical skill that had characterized the campaign's opening weeks, and by late November had pushed close enough to Moscow that forward reconnaissance units reported being able to see the towers of the Kremlin through field glasses. It was at exactly this point, with German forces at the absolute limit of what their supply lines, their mechanical endurance, and their soldiers' physical capacity to withstand plunging temperatures could sustain, that Guderian began raising increasingly urgent warnings through his own chain of command about the condition of his forces and the growing signs of a massive Soviet counterattack building against the extended, exposed flanks of the German advance. His Panzer engines, never designed for temperatures now regularly falling below -30°C, required soldiers to light fires beneath them for hours before they could even be started each morning. Machine guns and other automatic weapons, their lubricants congealed solid in the cold, jammed with a frequency that left entire units effectively disarmed at moments when combat readiness mattered most. German infantry, still equipped with the summer uniforms issued for a campaign Hitler had publicly promised would conclude before winter arrived, were suffering frostbite casualties at rates that, in some units, began to exceed casualties from actual combat. Guderian's specific warning, delivered through multiple channels in the final days of November and the opening days of December 1941, was that his forces around Tula, south of Moscow, were dangerously overextended, inadequately supplied, and increasingly vulnerable to exactly the kind of large-scale counterattack that Soviet troop movements, visible to German reconnaissance even through the harsh winter conditions, strongly suggested was being prepared. These warnings received limited attention from a German high command still operating under the assumption that Soviet resistance was approaching final collapse, an assumption reinforced by months of consistently successful German offensive operations that had left little institutional appetite for entertaining the possibility of a serious Soviet counteroffensive capability this deep into the campaign. On December 5, 1941, that assumption collapsed entirely, as the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive using precisely the fresh, winter-equipped Siberian divisions that the delay at Kiev had given Soviet planners the time to position. The scale of the Soviet counteroffensive that began on December 5th caught the German high command genuinely off guard, despite the warnings that Guderian and several other frontline commanders had been raising for weeks. Fresh Soviet divisions, equipped with winter camouflage, cold weather lubricants for their weapons, and crucially, tanks whose wide treads had been specifically designed to handle snow and mud in ways German armor simply could not match, struck German positions across a broad front with a ferocity that immediately threatened to encircle multiple forward German units that had pushed closest to Moscow during the preceding weeks. Guderian's own forces, positioned in an exposed salient near Tula, found themselves facing exactly the scenario he had spent the previous month warning his superiors about: a strong, well-supplied enemy force attacking into an overextended German position with inadequate reserves and no realistic prospect of reinforcement. Hitler's response to the crisis, issued as the Soviet attacks intensified through early December, was a standing order that would become one of the defining and most controversial decisions of the entire Eastern Front campaign. No German unit anywhere along the front was permitted to retreat under any circumstances, regardless of the tactical situation confronting individual commanders on the ground. The order reflected a specific, if strategically questionable, theory that Hitler had developed about the nature of the crisis. That a general retreat, once begun, would prove impossible to control or reverse, potentially triggering a rout similar to Napoleon's catastrophic 1812 withdrawal from Moscow, and that German forces, dug into fixed positions regardless of how exposed those positions were, would ultimately hold better than forces attempting to conduct a fighting withdrawal across open, snow-covered terrain in brutal winter conditions while under continuous enemy pressure. Guderian, watching his own troops facing potential encirclement and annihilation in positions he assessed as genuinely indefensible, reached a different conclusion, one grounded in the same tactical judgment that had made him Germany's most successful Panzer commander throughout the preceding 2 years of war. Holding an exposed position simply to satisfy a blanket order issued from headquarters hundreds of miles away, he believed, would not preserve German strength. It would simply guarantee the loss of experienced troops and irreplaceable equipment that a timely, organized withdrawal to more defensible terrain could instead preserve for future operations. In mid-December, facing what he judged to be an immediate and unacceptable risk of encirclement, Guderian ordered elements of his own forces to withdraw to a shorter, more defensible line, doing so without securing prior authorization from Hitler's headquarters, a decision he made with full awareness that it directly contradicted the standing no-retreat order and carried serious professional consequences. This was not, it is worth emphasizing, an act of panic or a loss of nerve under pressure. Guderian's withdrawal orders were tactically sound by nearly any conventional military standard, executed in an organized fashion that preserved the fighting capacity of the units involved rather than allowing them to be overrun in place, and consistent with exactly the kind of flexible, judgment-based command style that had produced his string of victories in Poland, France, and the opening months of the Soviet campaign. Several other German commanders facing similarly desperate situations along the front reached comparable conclusions during this same period, some executing unauthorized withdrawals of their own, reflecting a widespread professional judgment among experienced field officers that Hitler's blanket no-retreat policy, whatever theoretical merit it held as a general principle for preventing a total collapse, was proving tactically catastrophic when applied without exception to specific units in specific, genuinely untenable positions. Word of Guderian's unauthorized withdrawal reached Hitler's headquarters within days, arriving at a moment when Hitler's tolerance for exactly this kind of independent battlefield judgment, already strained by the shock of facing the war's first major reversal, had worn dangerously thin. Field Marshal von Bock, commanding Army Group Center and technically Guderian's immediate superior, found himself caught between a subordinate whose tactical judgment he largely respected and a supreme commander whose patience for any deviation from his explicit orders had all but disappeared entirely. By December 20th, 1941, the situation along Guderian's sector of the front had deteriorated further, and Guderian made the decision to request a personal meeting with Hitler, believing, based on his years of direct professional interaction with the German leader during the campaigns in Poland and France, that he could make the tactical case for continued operational flexibility more persuasively in person than through written reports that might be filtered, summarized, or dismissed before reaching Hitler directly. This judgment would prove to be a serious miscalculation about how much the relationship between Hitler and his generals had already shifted over the preceding months of the campaign. The meeting took place at Hitler's field headquarters, and multiple accounts from officers present describe an exchange that grew increasingly tense as Guderian laid out, in the same direct and confident manner that had characterized his professional communication style throughout his career, the specific tactical reasoning behind his withdrawal decision, the exposed nature of his forward positions, the absence of adequate winter equipment, the exhaustion of troops who had been fighting continuously since June without meaningful rest, and his professional assessment that continued adherence to a rigid no-retreat policy in his specific sector would result not in a heroic defensive stand, but in the unnecessary destruction of experienced combat units that Germany could not easily replace. Hitler, according to these accounts, grew visibly agitated as the discussion continued, at one point suggesting that Guderian's troops simply needed to demonstrate greater willpower and combat spirit rather than retreating in the face of difficulty, a framing that reflected Hitler's increasingly firm conviction, hardened by the shock of the campaign's first major setback, that determination and ideological resolve could substitute for the material and logistical realities his generals kept describing to him. Guderian, whose entire professional identity had been built around precisely the kind of clear-eyed tactical assessment that Hitler now seemed to be dismissing as insufficient willpower, pushed back against this characterization more directly than most officers in the German High Command would have dared to by this point in the war, a directness that likely reflected both his genuine conviction that he was tactically correct and his long personal history with Hitler, stretching back to the pre-war years, which may have led him to believe their professional relationship could absorb a more forceful disagreement than it actually could. The exchange ended without resolution, and within days, on December 25th and formalized on December 26, 1941, Hitler relieved Guderian of his command entirely, removing him from Panzer Group II and more broadly, from any active operational command role for the next 14 months. The official justification communicated through German military channels framed the dismissal in terms of Guderian's health, citing the physical toll of 18 continuous months of combat command, a face-saving explanation that fooled almost no one within the senior ranks of the German military who understood the actual sequence of events. The real cause was clearly understood throughout the officer corps to be Guderian's unauthorized withdrawal and his subsequent unwillingness to simply accept Hitler's characterization of the situation without pushing back, at a moment when Hitler had become acutely sensitive to any suggestion that his personal judgment about how to handle the winter crisis might be mistaken. Guderian himself, in his post-war memoirs, would describe the dismissal not as a response to any specific tactical failure on his part, but as the culmination of a deteriorating relationship in which Hitler had grown increasingly unwilling to tolerate the kind of direct, occasionally blunt professional disagreement that had characterized their interactions during the more successful early phases of the war, when Hitler's confidence in his own judgment had not yet hardened into the rigid inflexibility that would come to define his relationship with his general staff for the remainder of the conflict. The immediate tactical consequences of Guderian's dismissal are difficult to measure with precision, since the winter crisis of 1941 and 1942 involved dozens of German formations facing similar pressures across an enormous front, and no single commander's presence or absence can be isolated as the deciding factor in how the broader campaign unfolded. What can be documented with considerable confidence is the pattern that followed. German forces across the Eastern Front continued to suffer heavy losses through the remainder of the winter, in several cases specifically because rigid adherence to Hitler's no-retreat policy, applied by commanders who had directly witnessed what happened to Guderian when he exercised independent tactical judgment, led to exactly the kind of unnecessary encirclements and destroyed units that Guderian had argued his own withdrawal was specifically designed to prevent. The broader German army did eventually stabilize its front by the following spring, but only after absorbing losses in men and equipment that a more flexible defensive posture, of the kind Guderian and several other experienced commanders had advocated, might plausibly have reduced. Guderian himself spent the following 14 months entirely without an active command, a remarkable and pointed exile for a man who, at the moment of his dismissal, represented arguably the single most successful field commander Germany had yet produced in the war. He was not imprisoned, disgraced in any formal sense, or stripped of his rank, but he was conspicuously and deliberately excluded from any role in shaping German military operations during a period that included the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, the increasingly desperate defensive fighting across the southern sector of the Eastern Front, and the broader deterioration of Germany's overall strategic position that unfolded largely without any input from the officer whose operational philosophy had done more than anyone else's to define how German armored forces actually fought. Guderian's eventual return to active service in February 1943 came only after the scale of the Stalingrad disaster had made clear even to Hitler that the German army's officer corps needed the specific kind of technical and operational expertise Guderian possessed, particularly regarding the condition and capability of Germany's increasingly strained panzer forces. He was appointed Inspector General of Armor Troops, a position that gave him substantial influence over tank production, training, and doctrine, and in which capacity he would go on to correctly warn, in 1943, about the mechanical unreliability of the rushed Panther tank program ahead of the Battle of Kursk, a warning Hitler again chose to overrule, with consequences that validated Guderian's judgment just as clearly as the winter crisis of 1941 had. What Guderian was never again given for the remainder of the war was direct operational command of troops in the field, the specific role in which his particular combination of tactical instinct, mechanical understanding, and willingness to make rapid, high-stakes decisions under pressure had produced Germany's most consistent record of battlefield success throughout the war's opening years. This pattern would repeat itself one final time in Guderian's career. Appointed Chief of the Army General Staff in July 1944, in the aftermath of the July 20th assassination plot and the resulting purge of the officer corps, Guderian found himself once again in frequent, escalating conflict with Hitler over strategic decisions on the Eastern Front, particularly regarding the deployment of Germany's dwindling reserves and the question of whether and where strategic withdrawals should be permitted as Soviet forces pushed steadily westward through 1944 and into 1945. He was dismissed from this position as well in March 1945, roughly 6 weeks before the war's end, following yet another direct confrontation with Hitler over operational strategy, a final, almost symbolic repetition of the same fundamental conflict that had first cost him his command outside Moscow more than 3 years earlier. Guderian's experience, while perhaps the clearest single example of Hitler removing exceptional tactical talent at precisely the moment it was needed most, was far from an isolated case within the broader pattern of how Hitler managed his relationship with the German officer corps as the war progressed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the most experienced and respected senior commanders in the entire Wehrmacht, was dismissed and subsequently reinstated multiple times over the course of the war, each cycle following a broadly similar pattern. Rundstedt would offer professional military advice that conflicted with Hitler's preferred course of action. Hitler would remove him from command in response, and then, once circumstances validated Rundstedt's original judgment or a crisis emerged, requiring his particular experience, Hitler would reinstate him, only for the cycle to repeat again at the next major point of disagreement. Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the Army through the early years of the war, suffered what appears to have been a genuine physical health collapse under the strain of managing Hitler's increasingly direct interference in operational decisions, and was replaced not by another qualified field commander, but by Hitler himself, who formally assumed direct command of the army in December 1941, the same month Guderian was dismissed, eliminating the last meaningful institutional buffer between Hitler's personal judgment and the day-to-day conduct of operations on the Eastern Front. Franz Halder, who had served as Chief of the Army General Staff since before the war began, and whose private diary provides one of the most detailed contemporary records of the deteriorating relationship between Hitler and his professional military advisors, was himself dismissed in September 1942, Following months of increasingly sharp disagreements over strategy during the campaign that would culminate in the disaster at Stalingrad. Halder's removal followed the same essential pattern as Guderian's, a highly experienced, professionally respected officer, offering direct and increasingly blunt warnings about the gap between Hitler's strategic ambitions and Germany's actual military capacity to achieve them, ultimately removed not because his professional judgment was proven wrong, but because his willingness to voice that judgment directly had become, in Hitler's assessment, a form of disloyalty that could no longer be tolerated regardless of its accuracy. What makes Guderian's specific case such a particularly clear illustration of this broader pattern is the unusually tight and verifiable connection between the specific moment of his dismissal and the specific tactical crisis Germany was facing at that exact moment. Unlike some later command changes, where the connection between a general's removal and any specific operational consequence remains genuinely difficult to isolate amid the chaos of a collapsing multi-front war, Guderian's dismissal occurred within days of the exact tactical decision that triggered it, during the exact winter crisis where his specific expertise in mobile, flexible armored warfare was most acutely needed, and was followed by more than a year in which Germany's Panzer forces operated without the direct field leadership of the single commander most responsible for developing the doctrine those forces were built around in the first place. The timing leaves remarkably little ambiguity about cause and effect, in a war whose broader strategic narrative is otherwise frequently complicated by the difficulty of isolating any single decision's precise consequences from the overwhelming scale and complexity of the wider conflict. It is worth being careful about the limits of counterfactual military history, since no historian can say with certainty what would have happened had Guderian remained in command of Panzer Group II through the remainder of the winter crisis. What can be said with much greater confidence is what specific capability Germany lost the moment he was removed, and why that particular capability mattered so much given the exact nature of the crisis unfolding at that moment. Guderian's core professional strength was not simply aggressive attacking, the quality most associated with his reputation from the campaigns in Poland and France. It was flexible judgment under pressure, the ability to correctly assess when a position needed to be held at all costs versus when preserving a force through tactical withdrawal represented the better path to long-term combat effectiveness. This was precisely the judgment call that dozens of German commanders across the Eastern Front were being forced to make throughout December 1941 and into the opening months of 1942, as Soviet counterattacks probed for weaknesses across an enormous and thinly held front. By removing Guderian specifically for exercising this judgment, and by doing so in a highly visible way that became rapidly known throughout the senior ranks of the German officer corps, Hitler sent an unmistakable signal to every remaining field commander facing similar decisions in the following weeks and months. Independent tactical judgment that contradicted the no-retreat policy, however well-reasoned and however aligned with sound military doctrine, would be treated as a firing offense, regardless of its battlefield merit. This had a chilling effect that extended far beyond Guderian's own immediate sector, as commanders across the front, having watched Germany's most successful and most personally connected to Hitler Panzer general lose his command for exactly this kind of decision, became measurably more reluctant to exercise the same kind of independent judgment in their own sectors, even when their own tactical assessment suggested a withdrawal was the wiser course. Several post-war accounts from German officers who served through this period describe a palpable shift in command culture following Guderian's dismissal, a growing tendency to prioritize strict compliance with headquarters directives over battlefield judgment, even in situations where the officers involved privately believed compliance was tactically unsound. Historians examining the pattern of unnecessary encirclements and unit losses in the months following Guderian's dismissal have pointed to this chilling effect, alongside the specific loss of Guderian's own command presence, as a contributing factor in casualties that a more flexible defensive posture might have reduced. This dynamic reveals something important about the actual mechanism by which Guderian's removal damaged German military effectiveness, extending well beyond the simple loss of one talented individual commander. Militaries function, in large part, through the cumulative judgment of hundreds of individual officers, making real-time decisions under conditions no centralized headquarters can fully anticipate or control from a map table hundreds of miles away. Guderian's dismissal did not simply remove his personal tactical skill from the battlefield. It demonstrated in the starkest possible terms to every other commander watching that the kind of independent judgment the German General Staff System had spent generations training its officers to exercise would no longer be tolerated when it conflicted with Hitler's personal directives, regardless of how sound the underlying military reasoning happened to be. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, caught in the difficult position of serving as the intermediary between Guderian's tactical judgment and Hitler's absolute directives, later described the days surrounding the dismissal as among the most professionally uncomfortable of his own career. Forced to relay orders he privately suspected were tactically unsound to a subordinate whose battlefield instincts he had come to trust through months of successful joint operations. Bock's own diary entries from this period, examined by historians after the war, reveal a commander caught in an impossible position that would become increasingly familiar to senior German officers as the war progressed. Professionally obligated to enforce directives from a supreme commander whose judgment on specific tactical matters he had genuine reason to doubt, while lacking any institutional mechanism to formally challenge that judgment without risking the same fate that had just befallen Guderian. Bock himself would be relieved of his own command roughly a month later, in January 1942, following further disagreements over the conduct of the Winter Campaign, a sequence of events that left Army Group Center, one of the three principal German army groups on the Eastern Front, without either of the two senior commanders who had led it through the initial invasion, within the span of a single month. At the exact moment continuity of experienced leadership mattered most for managing an increasingly precarious defensive situation. The practical effect of this compounding leadership turnover extended well beyond the personal misfortune of the individual officers involved. Replacement commanders, brought in to fill the vacancies left by Guderian's and then Bock's dismissals, necessarily lacked the months of accumulated first-hand knowledge of their specific sectors of the front, the particular strengths and weaknesses of the units under their command, and the working relationships with subordinate officers that Guderian and Bock had developed through the shared experience of the campaign's opening months. Military effectiveness depends substantially on exactly this kind of accumulated situational knowledge, which cannot be transferred instantly through written orders or brief handover briefings, and the German Army's winter crisis of 1941 and 1942 was managed, in significant part, by a command structure that had lost much of this accumulated knowledge at precisely the moment the tactical situation most demanded experienced confident decision-making from officers who genuinely understood the specific terrain, unit capabilities, and enemy dispositions they were responsible for. Looking back at the full arc of Guderian's career across the entire war, from the theoretical development of German armor doctrine through his repeated cycles of dismissal and recall, a clear and somewhat tragic pattern emerges. He was, by the assessment of allies and enemies alike, one of the most capable practitioners of mechanized warfare that the Second World War produced, a commander whose judgment was repeatedly validated by events even when that judgment directly contradicted Hitler's own preferences at the moment it was offered. He was right about the risks of the Kiev diversion delaying the assault on Moscow past the point of viability. He was right about the tactical necessity of the December 1941 withdrawal that cost him his command. He was right 2 years later about the mechanical unreliability of the rushed Panther tanks ahead of Kursk. And, in each case, being right did not protect him from removal. In several cases, being demonstrably, provably correct seemed to accelerate his dismissal rather than prevent it. since Hitler appears to have experienced direct contradiction from a subordinate whose judgment kept proving sound as a more acute threat to his authority than contradiction from officers whose advice was more easily dismissed as simply mistaken. This pattern illuminates something essential about the broader question of why Germany, despite possessing what was, on paper, one of the most professionally trained and tactically sophisticated officer corps of any major combatant in the war, ultimately lost. The problem was rarely a shortage of correct answers arriving in Hitler's headquarters. Guderian's career alone demonstrates that the German military establishment repeatedly produced exactly the kind of clear-eyed, professionally grounded tactical analysis that a supreme commander genuinely interested in military success would have wanted to hear and act upon. The problem was a supreme commander who had come to experience professional disagreement, however well-founded, as a personal threat rather than a valuable input, and who therefore systematically removed his most capable and most independently minded officers at precisely the moments their specific expertise was needed most, replacing demonstrated competence with a narrowing circle of officers selected increasingly for their willingness to comply rather than their capacity to be right. In one particularly telling passage from his post-war writing, Guderian reflected specifically on the December 1941 dismissal, noting that he had never doubted the tactical soundness of his decision to withdraw, only underestimated how completely Hitler's tolerance for contradiction, even well-founded contradiction from a trusted and repeatedly vindicated commander, had already eroded by that point in the campaign. It was, in Guderian's own retrospective assessment, less a story about a single wrong decision than about a fundamental incompatibility that had been building for months between two different theories of how a war should be run. One grounded in the accumulated professional judgment of trained officers responding to battlefield conditions as they actually existed, and another grounded in the conviction that willpower, loyalty, and unwavering resolve from the top could ultimately overcome whatever material and tactical realities the battlefield presented. Germany's war effort for the remainder of the conflict would be run overwhelmingly according to the second theory, and Guderian's own career stands as one of its clearest and most costly casualties. Guderian survived the war, was captured by American forces in 1945, held briefly as a potential war crimes defendant before ultimately being released without charge, and lived until 1954, long enough to write memoirs that remain, to this day, one of the most influential first-hand accounts of mechanized warfare ever published by a practicing commander. He would spend those post-war years reflecting, with a particular clarity available only in hindsight, on a war in which his own theoretical brilliance had helped build the instrument of Germany's early, overwhelming victories, and in which his own tactical judgment, proven correct again and again under the pressure of actual combat, was repeatedly discarded by the one man whose approval determined whether that judgment would ever be allowed to matter.